Energy Media readers, we're going to talk about something today that is not specifically energy related, but has a lot of implications for the energy sector in Alberta. And that is the Fair Deal panels that the Kenney government struck, and the fact that they are now, that panel is now empowered to ask Albertans specifically about separation, secession, leaving Canada. To discuss that with me, I brought along again Shawn McCarthy, a veteran energy journalist. So welcome to the interview, Shawn.
Thank you, Markham.
Well, sir, what's your take on this story?
Well, first of all, let me be clear. I'm sitting in Ottawa. I am not in Alberta, and so I have followed it and I read about it, and I have lived in Alberta and sympathize with the plight of Albertans in terms of the hit their economy has taken. But I don't want to. I realize I'm injecting myself into a conversation here, but Alberta's part of Canada, and I'm sitting in the capital of Canada, so I guess fair ball. Look, I understand that when the world changes dramatically as it has in the oil and gas industry, which is what Alberta relies on for its wealth and has relied on for its wealth for the last several decades. Calls for reevaluating the deal in Canada are not inappropriate. I think that's fair ball to say, you counted on us for equalization for a long time. Now, we need to recalibrate, and we need to look at what the deal is here. And as I say, I think that's fair ball. I think the raising the specter of separation is not fair ball. I think it's blackmail, essentially. And I don't think the rest of the country is going to respond well to it.
And that's why I asked you on to discuss that, because of course you're going to have the Eastern Canadian perspective, if I may put that burden on your shoulders, if you don't mind. And of course you're going to be tapped into some of the networks around Ottawa, the capital, the scuttlebutt. You're going to, as you're sipping your latte in Starbucks, you're going to overhear cabinet ministers and so on chattering about this. And so I think that's why I wanted you on. And I think this sends the absolute worst message at the worst time for Alberta, because Alberta needs Canada. They need infrastructure. They need support for various programs. They need to come to accommodation on climate policy and other policies. And not only does this smack of extortion, it is heavy-handed, and I don't think this is the kind of strategy that Canadians will look fondly on.
Right. And, we talked in the past about them following a Quebec model. The threat of separation is always out there. But to be honest with you, I don't recall a politician from Quebec who was not a declared sovereignist making the threat of separation to achieve what they wanted, or raising the specter of separation as explicitly as is now happening in Alberta. So yes, I mean, the Quebecers and the Quebec society, that threat was always out there, but it was René Lévesque who called the referendum, and he was avowed separatist. It was Jacques Parizeau who called a referendum, and he was an avowed souverainist. And the Parti Québécois has always had that explicitly as their agenda, but the nominally federal, and actually federal, I guess, leaders of Quebec have always led against that and said, no, we are Canadians. We might need a new deal within Canada. They're willing to argue for that, and at times that has been appropriate. And I would argue that at times it's appropriate for Alberta to argue that maybe there needs to be a new deal in Canada. But that's not the quid pro quo here, right? I mean, that's not using the separatist argument to explicitly say we're going to take our marbles and go home.
Well, and there's another big difference here, and that is Quebec's separatist movement has always been founded on the idea that Quebec has a separate history, it has a separate culture, has a separate language, it even has a separate legal system. Yeah. I mean, it is very different, the distinct society.
Right.
Alberta, Alberta tries to make that argument, but I mean, it's the difference between California and Texas. It's not the difference between Canada and France.
Right.
And so that argument that Quebec makes, juxtapose that against the argument that Alberta makes, which is that you won't build us a pipeline, therefore we're going to go off on our own. That I don't see Canadians getting behind that kind of a demand.
Well, and let's be honest. I mean, it seems to be patently ridiculous to think that you won't build us a pipeline, so we're going to separate. So now you're going to build us a pipeline. I mean, that doesn't seem to follow that other provinces in the Federation of Canada who just were spurned by Alberta with some kind of a Brexit Western style are now going to be more inclined to want to build pipelines through their jurisdictions. And again, let's remember, it's not just through provinces that they've had trouble getting pipelines built. The Americans have also, two major pipeline projects that have been on the books for a long time down there and have not been built despite nearly 4 years or 3 years at least of Donald Trump in the White House. So, the problems go way beyond whether Quebec or British Columbia, for example, are willing to pave the way for pipelines to be built.
And this is a problem that I've identified a long time ago, is the fact the world is changing. And Alberta has to acknowledge that it's changing and align itself with those changes, and which it does, frankly, was doing under Notley and now is going backwards with Kenney. I think that's you can make a good argument for that. Let's put it that way. But here, there's a bigger problem here, and that is the way politics are getting done these days in the prairie provinces, particularly Saskatchewan and Alberta. It used to be, you'd have fights. I mean, Peter Lougheed would fight with Pierre Trudeau and all of that. But, at the end of the day, alliances were forged, compromises were made, deals were cut, deals were exchanged, all of that. And that's, in a decentralized confederation, that seems to me to be how politics gets done. This is different altogether. And it seems like a scorched earth kind of policy.
I think that there's more at play. I think that in the second decade, third decade now of the 21st century, there is a cultural polarization in North America and indeed in the Western world. And these issues have become part of a much broader cleavage. They always were to some degree, but we're living in our own echo chambers, and the cultural cleavages, I think, have become more pronounced, not less. The populist agenda, Trump versus Bernie Sanders in the United States, and I think that we're reacting as our home team tribal instincts are leading us, and it's often yelling past each other, and I can't imagine that the conversation you and I are having right now would sway a lot of people who are calling for Alberta to separate, even if they heard the argument. It's a different set of facts that we're operating from. Sometimes they're facts, sometimes they're myths, and it's a wholly different perspective, and that just colors the whole debate.
Final question, Shawn. In my opinion, the way out of this is better leadership and vision and narratives that Canadians and Albertans can get behind and be not united, but more aligned, more united than they currently are now, less tribal perhaps. It's leadership is at the end of the day that will bring us together to address these cultural cleavages, the structural change in the global energy system, all of these things that are, bedeviling Alberta. What do you think is the solution?
Well, I'm not sure there is a solution, but I would agree with you that leadership is important, and it would be helpful if leaders weren't stoking separatist sentiments. I would say it would be helpful on the other side if leaders in the rest of Canada were not looking for cleavages and running apparently running against certain regions. You know, the complaint in Alberta was that the Liberals were running against Alberta in the last election, you know, for advantage elsewhere. So, you know, efforts being made to bridge those differences are really important, and to find, again, I'm as you I know you're not suggesting we're all going to agree on anything. There is some common ground I think that you can find. I think in the age of climate change, when you have relied heavily on high emissions products, whether it's oil and gas, or for that matter, meat and beef, which is often attacked by the environmental community as being a big source of emission. This is existential stuff, and you know, it doesn't get solved. At best, it gets managed, and the direction that the world is going to go is where we're going to go, and sometimes people are going to be dragged kicking and screaming into it, and you know, not for the betterment of anybody, for sure, but you know, as human beings, that seems to be the way we are.
With those wise words, we'll end the interview. Shawn, a pleasure as always. We'll look forward to the next one.
Thanks, Mark, and we'll talk to you soon.